Our first reading today is from Acts 1, verses 34 through 43. Then Peter began to speak to them. I truly understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. You know the message he sent to all the people of Israel, preaching peace by Jesus Christ. He is Lord of all. That message spread throughout Judea, beginning in Galilee, after the baptism that John announced. How God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and with power. How he went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, for God was with him. We are witness to all that he did, both in Judea and in Jerusalem. They put him to death by hanging him on a tree. But God raised him on the third day and allowed him to appear, not to all the people, but to us who were chosen by God as witnesses, and who ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. He commanded us to preach to the people and to testify that he is the one ordained by God as judge of the living and the dead. All the prophets testify about him, that everyone who believes in him receives forgiveness of sins through his name.
A reading from Mark chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices, so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away from the stone for us, from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man, dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.
Happy Easter. So what's up with this whole resurrection thing? Sometimes fail to see what's so special about it. What's the big deal? Jesus was God and he got up out of the grave. Well, okay. So God can't get himself out of the grave? If he can't, who can? What's so impressive about that? I mean, if we were gods, I would think that we too would be able to get out of the tomb and move this big stone and walk ourselves out of there. So why do we come here and celebrate that God got up out of the grave after being killed? Isn't it weird enough that God was killed in the first place? I mean, it's that whole God is dead philosophy, right? In the 60s, God is dead, cover of Time magazine. And then all of a sudden, oh, just kidding, God is still alive. Came up out of the grave. Oh, what's the big deal? So what? God wasn't the point. The point of Jesus being divine, the point of Jesus being the living, breathing Son of God wasn't the point because, see, the people of that time, the people in first century Palestine, they weren't impressed by the whole living God thing. See, they were surrounded by living gods. The Emperor of Rome was a living God according to their theology. And when an emperor would die, they'd join the pantheon of gods in wherever, maybe up on Mount Olympus or wherever it was they went. So it wasn't a big deal. Even King David was called Son of God. The problem was, every time the Jews found a Son of God, they got disappointed. Jesus got himself killed. All the other living gods that they knew were a complete and utter disappointment because they used their power, supposedly divinely mandated, to oppress the people. Look at all the emperors of Rome. Look at their track record. on issues of humanity. They failed miserably. Look at Herod, the real king of the Jews at the time, the king over Judea. The guy was out of his mind. He killed his wife, his in-laws, his own sons, because he was paranoid that they were going to take over his throne. He was the divinely mandated king over the Jews, and nobody else was going to take that from him. And then in all of his delusions, he hears of this prophecy that this baby has been born in Bethlehem, and that this baby is going to become the king of the Jews. And he wasn't about to let that happen. What did he do? He ordered that they all be wiped out. Every child under the age of 2. Right? We all remember the story. And we can see why the Jews, and not even the Romans, would have been really impressed with this whole living God thing. So to say that Jesus, God, comes out of the grave on Easter, and here we are all these years later celebrating it, really doesn't give us a whole lot of excitement, because so what? See, the point wasn't the divinity. The point was the humanity. The impressive thing is that Jesus, not just God, but Jesus, the human, was able to get up out of that tomb. And that is what gives us hope for ourselves. Think of the disciples back then. We read this passage in Mark that actually ends with verse 8. Now, some Bibles will have verses 9 through 20 as well, but that said that those were added later. Okay? So Mark is the first gospel written. And then you've got the other Gospels that are based off of it, and then you've got John, which is a very Hellenistic, Greek-influenced gospel that was written much later. Okay. Where did Jesus appear to the disciples in Mark? He didn't. There was no sighting of Jesus after the resurrection in Mark. But when you look at the other texts, how did they recognize Jesus? You remember the text where they're walking down this road and they find this stranger and they say, hey, it's getting late, why don't you join us and let's have a meal together? And they still have no idea who this guy is. And the guy goes with them and he sits down and then he takes the bread and he breaks it and they realize that this is Jesus. It wasn't in his divinity that they recognized him, it was in his humanity. Sitting among them and breaking bread, that is how they recognized him. You look at the other text, Jesus appears to the other disciples, and Thomas comes along later and says, you guys are full of it. There's no way you saw Jesus. He's dead. I saw it, believe me. He wasn't getting out of that one. So when Jesus appears to Thomas, how does he recognize him? By his wounds. He takes his finger and he puts it into the wound, and that is how he recognizes Jesus, not because he is a perfect, all-powerful God, but because he was also a broken and battered human being, wounded, the wounded healer, as it were. And that is how the disciples recognized him. That's how they knew who Jesus was. See, later on today, we're going to take communion, and I don't think Jesus was ever concerned that we would lose the sense of sacredness about communion. I think Jesus was more worried that we would lose the sense of humanness about communion, about sharing bread and cup with one another, because it's in those things that we see Christ resurrected. It's in those things that we see the power of this message of resurrection that we celebrate every year. Well, why bother doing this little song and dance every year? Because it reminds us of the possibility of our own resurrections. See, in our own resurrection is Christ's resurrection made manifest. You remember after the Epiphany, right, the Transfiguration, and Jesus on top of the mountain, and Elijah and Moses appear with them, and finally when they come back down the mountain after Peter has his little debacle and is basically told to shut up, and they come back down, and the disciples that were still waiting at the bottom of the mountain, this man comes up to Jesus and says, hey, your disciples couldn't heal my son. I need you to do something. He's sick. Right? What did Jesus say to them? You wicked generation, how long must I be with you? How long must I go doing things for you? Every stage of Jesus' life and death, he was teaching us something so that we could learn to be empowered to do for ourselves. The resurrection is no exception. Jesus' resurrection was to show us that we too can get out of our tombs and make of our lives what we are called to be. Oh, but it's so difficult. We think back to Plato's story of the cave where the man is chained against the wall and he's facing this wall and there's a burning fire, right? And these people are going along this stone bridge back and forth, and he keeps seeing these shadows played on the wall in front of him. So he thinks he has an idea of what life is like in the world outside. But when he's finally freed, he goes out there and he realizes he was completely wrong. In fact, he's so terrified by the uncertainty of not knowing what's really happening, he goes back into the cave. It's no accident that the Mark text ends with the disciples running away because they were terrified. They didn't know what to expect. And so when we are in our metaphorical tomb, and we see this big, imposing stone in front of us, and we're just wishing and hoping that we had these powers of divinity like Jesus did to be able to just zap the stone out of the way or hurl it or however it happened, then we're missing the point. Because the point is that not only was the stone already moved away, we read that in the text, right? The stone had already moved away. But even further, that the stone perhaps was an illusion from the beginning. Perhaps that stone was something that we placed there ourselves to keep ourselves in the tomb because we were too afraid of what we would find if we go out. There in the dark of the tomb was just a little bit of light splashing in between the boulder and the edge of the doorway. There in that light was uncertainty that lie beyond that stone. So sometimes it's easier to leave the rock there. Sometimes it's easier to say, I don't have the strength to move it out of the way because I am a mere human being and I am too broken and I am too wounded. I've been beaten around and I just don't have the strength or the energy to move this stone out of the way. That is an illusion. Jose was a gangbanger. He was in his 20s finally when he started to get himself straightened out, and he was volunteering for this organization called Homeboy Industries. Great name, isn't it? Basically, it's an organization where gang members will go and try to find a different path in life. Right? And so they run all these different businesses and they try to empower one another. And so Jose is there and he's helping out with some simple tasks and whatnot. And then he realizes, I just might have something to say too. And so he stands up before all of these young men and women and he tells his own story. Nobody had ever known. Everybody always knew that Jose was kind of a bad you-know-what, and had all the tattoos all over the place. He was just kind of rough. Not that he was bad, but he was just rough, right? And so he stands up there and he explains to everybody, he says, my mother used to beat me every day without fail. When I was 6 years old, she turned to me and she says, why don't you just kill yourself? Do everybody a favor because you are a real burden. Finally, when he was 9, she drove him all the way down as far south as she could get before she would get into Mexico and found a little orphanage there. She walked him up to the front door and said, here, I found this kid. And she dropped him there. Finally, 90 days later, his grandma was able to find where his mother had dropped him. And she went down and picked him up and brought him back home. But with Mom being home, the beatings continued. And he explained to that crowd, he says, every day of my life up until my mid-20s, I wore 3 t-shirts to cover all these nasty, ugly scars that I have all over my body from all the beatings. He said, then suddenly, I realized if I hid my own wounds, how could I help others heal their own wounds? So he became more open, more transparent, stopped wearing 3 t-shirts. He let other people see his wounds. Whether he was proud of them or not, we don't know, but he embraced them as his own, as a mark of his own humanity. And he too showed that even as a human being who may have been kicked around or abused, who maybe is imposing his or her own little prison, also, just like taught by Jesus so long ago, could stand up and have courage and see themselves as a human being, wonderfully and beautifully made in the image of a powerful God. And that individual, just like all of us here today, no matter how young, no matter how old, no matter how beaten, no matter how empowered, could also stand up and see that the stone was never there to begin with, but that we had put it there for ourselves as kind of a safety net, almost an excuse for complacency. I encourage all of us to open our eyes and let the light pour into the tomb, not just around the edges of the stone that's so big and so seemingly difficult to move. No, let the light pour in from everywhere, because the stone is not there. The strength belongs to all of us. And it's not only our being made in the image of God, it's not only our own piece of divinity that makes us beautiful, but it's our humanness. Every bruise, scratch, and mark makes us who we are. So let's find a way to embrace it. Happy Easter.